The world was no longer the place it once was. A relentless wave of chaos had torn through every corner of civilization, leaving cities in ruins, the sky perpetually gray with ash, and a silence where once the hustle of life had thrived. The undead roamed freely, their insatiable hunger marking every step they took. Among the few remaining survivors, whispers of a place that still held hope circulated like a lifeline. A hidden base deep in the heart of what was once America, now abandoned and thought to be forgotten, was rumored to be the key to humanity's survival. The base, known only to a few, had been silent for years. But now, it was humanity's last chance to make a stand against the never-ending horde of zombies. Some called it the Forgotten Base, a fortress where the remaining forces were rumored to be regrouping, preparing for a final offensive. Within the scattered remnants of a broken city, a group of survivors, each bearing the scars of a world ravaged by death, gathered, drawn by the same desperate hope. These survivors, though different in background and expertise, shared one thing in common: they were all fleeing from the growing wave of zombies and seeking refuge at the base, which had become the last beacon of resistance. The group's leader, a former soldier named David, held a map tightly in his hand as he led the way through the overgrown streets. The map was old, tattered, but it was the only clue they had to the Forgotten Base's location. David's face was hardened from years of survival, and his eyes reflected a deep weariness that few could understand. He wasn't just leading these people, he was hoping, just like them, that this base could offer a future where the undead did not rule the earth. Behind him, a few of the other survivors shuffled along. There was Emily, a doctor, whose once calm and steady demeanor had long since been replaced by a hardened resolve. Mark, a former engineer, constantly tinkered with any machine he could find, hoping to create something that could help them survive in this nightmarish world. And then there was Sarah, a quiet young woman with a past she refused to speak of, but whose sharp instincts had kept her alive thus far. The tension was palpable as they made their way through the abandoned city. Every creak of a broken window, every distant moan of a zombie in the distance, set their nerves on edge. Yet, they kept moving. There was no turning back now. "We're getting close," David muttered, glancing at the sky. Dark clouds hung low, signaling an impending storm. The survivors quickened their pace, but a sense of dread hung in the air. They all knew that even if the base was there, it would not be without its own dangers. The undead were not the only threat that lurked in this new world. Humans, desperate, broken, and ruthless, could be just as dangerous. As they neared the outskirts of the city, the air grew colder, the atmosphere heavier. David's grip on the map tightened as he spotted a rusted sign barely visible through the foliage. His heart raced. They were close. Just a few more miles, and they would find the base, if it still existed. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of zombies shuffling toward them. The survivors froze, the fear in their eyes betraying the urgency of their situation. They had no choice but to fight their way through. With only a few weapons between them, they quickly formed a loose circle, bracing for the oncoming onslaught. David's voice cut through the panic. "We hold our ground here. Fight, and then we move forward. The base is just ahead. We can't let them stop us now." Emily nodded, her medical bag now slung across her back, ready to tend to the wounded when, and if, this was over. Mark adjusted the makeshift weapon in his hand, a sharp metal pipe he had scavenged from an old car wreck. Sarah scanned the horizon, her eyes darting back and forth as she looked for the fastest route to escape should things go south. The first of the zombies appeared through the fog, their twisted forms moving erratically. A grotesque parody of the life they once knew, these creatures were driven by an endless hunger. And they were closing in fast. David's heart pounded in his chest. He knew the odds were against them. But he also knew they had no other choice. They had to make it to the Forgotten Base. It was humanity's last hope, and they would fight for it with everything they had left. As the first zombie lunged toward David, he swung his rifle in a swift motion, knocking the creature to the ground. But there was no time to savor the victory. More were coming, and they were getting closer with each passing second. The survivors braced for the fight ahead, knowing that their journey was far from over. The Forgotten Base was within reach, but the question remained, would they survive long enough to see it? The survivors fought desperately, their hearts racing as the zombies came at them in waves. The moans and growls of the undead filled the air, a terrifying symphony of hunger and decay. Each blow they struck seemed to only delay the inevitable as more of the creatures emerged from the mist, drawn by the scent of living flesh. David swung his rifle with precision, taking down one of the zombies with a swift shot to the head. But there were too many. They seemed to be everywhere, their grotesque forms emerging from every corner of the ruined city. He knew they had to move. They couldn't stay here and fight forever. Move! Now! David shouted, rallying the group. His voice was steady despite the chaos around him, but the panic in his eyes was undeniable. This wasn't a fight they could win. It was a race against time. Emily, Mark, and Sarah followed him without hesitation, weaving through the alleyways, their steps quick but measured. Emily's breath came in short gasps, her medical bag bouncing against her side as she ran. Her hands were already shaking from the intensity of the encounter, but she pushed through it. Survival came first, everything else would have to wait. Mark, ever the resourceful one, scanned their surroundings for anything that could be used to slow the zombies down. He spotted a wrecked car up ahead and made a snap decision. Over there! We can use the car to block the way, he yelled. Without waiting for a response, Mark sprinted toward the vehicle, Sarah close behind him. They reached the car in moments, and together, they managed to push it into the narrow street, creating a makeshift barricade. The zombies were closing in fast, but the barrier would give them a brief respite. David kept the group moving, his eyes darting from side to side as he assessed their surroundings. The base was close, he knew it. But with every passing second, they were getting more exposed. The noise from the fight had likely attracted more zombies, and they couldn't afford to waste any time. Just a little farther, David muttered to himself, trying to push his exhaustion aside. His legs felt like lead, but he kept running. There was no choice. As they made their way through a narrow alley, a sharp crack echoed in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. David froze. The sound was too close for comfort. Someone else was out there, and that could mean trouble. Stay close, David ordered, his voice low but firm. We need to move faster. They pushed on, the gunfire growing louder, but still in the distance. It was clear that whoever was out there wasn't just firing randomly, they were fighting. But against what? The possibility of other human survivors posed a new kind of danger. Could these people be trusted, or would they prove to be more deadly than the zombies themselves? Sarah glanced back, her eyes scanning the area as she tried to make sense of the situation. Do you think we'll make it? She asked, her voice shaky. It was the first time she'd voiced any doubt since joining the group, and David could see the fear in her eyes. We have to, he replied, his voice resolute. We don't have another choice. The group pressed forward, moving through the derelict streets with a newfound urgency. The base was within reach, just beyond the horizon, but every step felt like a gamble. The sound of approaching zombies grew louder, their raspy breathing mixing with the pounding of feet as they neared. The barricade would only hold for so long before the creatures broke through. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a clearing. A large, abandoned compound loomed before them, its high walls standing in stark contrast to the desolation surrounding it. This was it. The forgotten base, the last hope for humanity. But as they approached the gates, the hairs on the back of David's neck stood up. The place was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Is anyone here? David called out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. The only response was the sound of the wind rustling through the overgrown plants around the base. They made their way to the gates, which were rusted but still intact. David tried to push them open, but they wouldn't budge. Something was off. This was supposed to be a stronghold, a place of safety and resistance. But it looked abandoned. Come on, Mark muttered, tugging at the gate, his frustration growing. It can't be empty. We need to get in there. Emily stepped forward, looking around. Maybe there's another way in. We can't stay out here. Not with the zombies closing in. David nodded grimly. Right. Let's find another way. The group split up, checking the perimeter for any weaknesses or entry points. But the tension in the air was undeniable. Something didn't feel right. The sounds of zombies were getting louder by the second, and as they searched for an entrance, David couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. It wasn't just the undead that posed a threat anymore. The forgotten base might have its own secrets, and David was about to discover that some places were better left untouched. As the group moved closer to the walls, a faint sound echoed from inside. It was unmistakable, the sound of something, or someone, moving. David's pulse quickened. Did you hear that? They all froze, eyes darting around, each of them trying to figure out if it was just the wind or if someone, was waiting for them inside. The moment the sound echoed from within the walls, every survivor stiffened. It wasn't the shuffle of zombie feet, the groans of the undead, or the usual ominous noises that accompanied their cursed existence. No, this sound was deliberate, measured, almost human. David's grip on his rifle tightened. Stay alert, he whispered urgently, his voice low, almost a growl. He motioned for the others to crouch behind the ruins of a nearby wall, out of sight. Emily, Mark, and Sarah obeyed without hesitation, instinctively understanding the gravity of the situation. They had survived too long to be caught off guard now. The gate loomed ahead, still firmly locked, but through the gaps in the rusted bars, the survivors could see shadows moving within. Something, or someone, was inside. But who, or what, could it be? David's mind raced. It was possible the base had been overtaken by a group of survivors. It was also possible they had been waiting for anyone to approach, preparing for their next move. But what if the base wasn't a haven of refuge at all? What if it had become something far more sinister, a den of horrors where the line between the living and the dead had long since blurred? David motioned to Mark. The former engineer stepped forward, his eyes scanning the area for any weaknesses or openings. Mark's hands were steady as he reached down, working the lock on the side gate with a makeshift tool he'd crafted from scraps found along the way. There's something off about this place, Mark muttered under his breath. I can't put my finger on it. Yeah, I feel it too, Sarah replied, her voice trembling slightly. Like we're walking into a trap. David shot a quick glance at her, but his focus remained on the entrance. We don't have time to second-guess ourselves. If there are people inside, we need to talk to them. If not, we need to know who, or what, they are. The sounds from inside grew more distinct, like whispers or footsteps, hushed but purposeful. David's instincts screamed at him to move quickly, to get in before whatever was waiting inside realized they were here. With a final click, the lock on the gate gave way. Mark pushed the heavy gate open just enough to slip through, and the others followed him into the darkened compound. The base stretched out before them, vast and eerily silent. The only sound now was the rustling of the wind through the overgrown vegetation and the soft thuds of their boots against the cracked concrete. As they stepped deeper into the compound, they noticed the eerie stillness that surrounded them. There were no zombies wandering the grounds, no signs of battle. Just an unsettling calm. The buildings were old, abandoned, yet some of them looked intact, as though someone had been maintaining them. David motioned for the others to be quiet as they moved forward, every sense heightened, alert for any sign of life, or death. Stay close. We don't know what's here, he muttered. Suddenly, a faint voice echoed from behind one of the buildings. It was too far to make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, desperate. Someone was definitely inside. David motioned for the group to follow him. They moved quickly but cautiously, their eyes darting around for any danger. It wasn't long before they rounded a corner, coming face to face with a small group of people, 5 in total, huddled near a makeshift fire, their faces gaunt and weary. The group froze when they saw the survivors, their eyes widening with a mix of fear and curiosity. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard and wild eyes, raised a hand. Who are you? His voice was hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in days. David kept his rifle low but ready. We're just passing through. We've heard rumors about this place. We need to know what's going on here. The man eyed them with suspicion. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This place is, it's not what you think. David's pulse quickened. Something about the man's words struck him as ominous. What do you mean? He asked, keeping his voice steady. The bearded man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the others, as if searching for some kind of confirmation. Finally, he spoke again, his voice strained. It's not safe. You should leave, now. The base, it's a trap. They're waiting for you. David's heart skipped a beat. A trap? What was he talking about? Who are they? Before he could ask more, a low growl broke the tension in the air. At first, David thought it was just the wind, but the growl grew louder, more distinct. It was followed by the unmistakable shuffle of feet. The zombies had found them. David's eyes narrowed. Get down. Move, he shouted, instinctively reaching for the rifle slung across his back. The survivors ducked for cover, but there was nowhere to hide. The zombies were everywhere. They emerged from the shadows, dozens of them, their twisted forms staggering toward the group, their eyes locked onto the living flesh they could smell. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the survivors could hear the unmistakable wet sound of their decaying bodies as they drew closer. The group fought to hold their ground, but the numbers were overwhelming. David shot the first zombie in the head, but it barely slowed them down. Emily grabbed a rusty pipe and swung it at a nearby zombie, knocking it to the ground. Mark grabbed a sharp shard of metal and jabbed it into the skull of another. The chaos was deafening. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the group was surrounded. David's eyes locked with the bearded man's, and the fear in the stranger's eyes told him everything. There was something else at play here. Something far more dangerous than the undead. A chilling realization crept into David's mind. The forgotten base wasn't just a refuge, it was a breeding ground for something much darker. And now, they were trapped inside it. The survivors fought with all their might, but the tide of zombies seemed endless. David's breath was ragged, his arms burning from the effort of constantly swinging his rifle, firing, reloading, and firing again. Each shot that landed brought down another one, but it felt like they were multiplying faster than they could handle. It was as if the base itself was calling them in, drawing them from the shadows like moths to a flame. Move back! David shouted, trying to guide his group toward a more defensible position. But there was no safe ground here. The walls were high, and the undead were closing in from all directions. The base that had once been their beacon of hope was now a trap, and they were caught in its snare. Mark grabbed Sarah by the arm, pulling her toward an abandoned building near the compound's edge. Get inside, he urged. Now! They ran, with the group trailing close behind, but the zombies were relentless, forcing them to scatter and find shelter wherever they could. Emily darted into a nearby maintenance shed, slamming the door behind her. David didn't hesitate, he made a quick decision to join her, firing at a zombie that was too close for comfort before diving into the safety of the building. Inside, the survivors huddled together, panting for breath. The sound of the undead moaning and crashing against the shed door echoed in their ears, a constant reminder that their time was running out. What the hell is going on here? Emily asked, her voice strained with fear. Who are those people outside? And what did that guy mean when he said this place was a trap? David wiped his brow, his eyes scanning the interior for anything useful. We don't know. But it's clear that whatever's going on here, it's not just about the zombies. There was a pause as the group absorbed this. Mark and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances. David could see the doubt beginning to creep into their expressions. We need answers, Sarah finally spoke up. If we don't figure out what's happening, we'll be stuck here, just waiting for the end. David nodded. He could feel the weight of their survival on his shoulders. It was always about the next step, the next choice. But this time, the next step wasn't clear. Just then, a loud crash from outside interrupted their thoughts. The door to the shed shuddered violently as someone, pounded against it. The survivors froze. That wasn't a zombie, Mark muttered, his hand gripping the broken piece of metal he'd been using as a weapon. No, David agreed, his voice low. That was too deliberate. Suddenly, the door crashed open, and the survivors instinctively reached for their weapons. But to their shock, it wasn't a zombie that had broken through, it was a human figure, bloodied but alive, with an intense, wild look in his eyes. The man stumbled into the shed, panting heavily. His clothes were torn, his face covered in dirt and grime. And, just as they were about to raise their weapons in defense, he dropped to his knees, gasping for air. I need help, he wheezed, barely able to form the words. David didn't move immediately. There was something off about this man. But Emily, ever the compassionate one, rushed forward to check on him. Who did this to you? She asked, kneeling beside him and pressing her hand to his shoulder. What happened? The man's eyes flickered up to hers, his face twisted in pain. The people inside, the ones who've been here, they're not just surviving anymore. They're making something. Something worse. David's stomach churned. He had heard whispers of experiments, mad science, but this? This was something else entirely. What do you mean? David asked, his tone demanding answers. The man struggled to speak through ragged breaths. They're turning people into something else. Something worse than zombies. We tried to stop them, but they're too strong. A cold chill ran down David's spine. Turning people into something worse? The idea of human experimentation, turning people into monsters, was almost too horrifying to comprehend. But in this new world, nothing seemed impossible anymore. Who are they? Mark asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Who's doing this? The man hesitated, his eyes darting around the shed. He seemed afraid, not of the zombies, but of something, or someone, much worse. The ones in charge, they call themselves the Forsaken. They believe the end of humanity is a new beginning. They're using the undead as a foundation for their experiments. They've found a way to enhance them, to control them. Emily gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. They're controlling the zombies? The man nodded grimly. Not just controlling. They're turning people into them. People like you and me. David's mind reeled at the implications. The Forsaken, some group of people willing to go to unimaginable lengths in the name of their twisted vision. But what kind of monsters would they create? And how many had they already made? We have to stop them, David said, his voice steady but fierce. We can't let this go on. If they're turning people into these things, we need to destroy whatever they're doing. The man slowly rose to his feet, his hand shaking as he gripped the doorframe for support. You don't understand. They've already turned the base into their breeding ground. And they'll stop at nothing to finish what they've started. David stared at the man, his mind whirling with dread. If what he said was true, the base had become a dark laboratory where the Forsaken twisted the very fabric of life itself. And the survivors' only chance was to stop them before the transformation reached its horrific conclusion. We'll have to fight them, David said, determination stealing his resolve. But we need to move quickly. The longer we wait, the more they'll build their army. Mark clenched his fists. Let's end this. Whatever they're creating, it dies with us. And so, the survivors steeled themselves for what was to come. The forgotten base had once been a symbol of hope, but now it was a place where humanity's worst instincts had taken root. It was up to them to destroy it, and stop whatever the Forsaken had set in motion. They had no choice but to go in, guns blazing, hearts full of rage, and minds set on survival. Because in this dark, desolate world, they were the last line of defense between the human race and the horrors the Forsaken had unleashed. The survivors moved out of the shed cautiously, weapons in hand, minds focused on the dark revelation they had just uncovered. The Forsaken, the people behind the horrors inside the base, were no mere survivors. They were a twisted cult, determined to rebuild the world in their own image by using the undead as tools of power and domination. David led the group, each step heavy with the weight of the decision they had made. The door behind them had been left ajar, and the sound of the undead shuffling in the distance grew louder, but they couldn't afford to let the zombies slow them down. They had bigger enemies to face now. "We need to find where they're doing this," David muttered, his eyes scanning the dimly lit base. The heart of the operation. The man who had joined them, who was still weak from his earlier encounter, pointed toward a tall, dark structure at the center of the base. It looked like a high-tech facility, incongruous amidst the decaying ruins. It was isolated, a fortress within a fortress, surrounded by fencing and guarded by armed men. "That's where it all happens," he said with a tremble. "The Forsaken's headquarters. Are there any entrances?" Emily asked, her voice steady but laced with fear. She was the one who had the most to lose. She had a daughter back home, if she still had a home, and the last thing she wanted was to die in this nightmare. The man hesitated, his eyes dark with memories he didn't want to revisit. "There are gates, but they're heavily guarded. They don't take kindly to strangers, and they'll shoot first and ask questions later. You'll need a distraction if you want to get in." David nodded. "Then we'll make a distraction." Mark, ever the planner, spoke up. "If we can get to the power generator, we might be able to shut down their defenses temporarily. That'll give us a window of opportunity to infiltrate the building." David turned to the group. "It's a gamble, but we don't have a choice. We need to act fast. We take out their power, and then we storm the compound. Whatever's inside, we end it." As the group made their way toward the generator area, they could feel the tension building. Each corner turned, each creaking door, each shuffle of feet in the distance made them more and more on edge. But they had come too far to turn back. The Forsaken had to be stopped. They approached the generator building, a squat structure tucked between two larger, derelict buildings. It was shielded from view by piles of debris and vegetation, making it the perfect spot for their operation. As they neared, David held up his hand, signaling for everyone to stop. The sound of approaching footsteps, heavy boots crunching on the dry earth, reached his ears. "Get low," he whispered. They crouched behind the generator building, hearts racing, the sound of footsteps growing louder. They watched as two figures passed by, clad in the same military-like gear as the man they had encountered earlier. These were the Forsaken soldiers, vigilant, hardened, and merciless. David didn't wait for the soldiers to pass completely. He motioned for Mark and Sarah to flank the left side of the building, while Emily and the injured man would stay close to him. They had to act quickly before their presence was detected. In the darkness, the group moved silently, their footsteps muffled by the broken asphalt beneath their feet. Mark and Sarah reached the far side of the generator building first, while David and Emily took a moment to check their surroundings. The injured man, still shaking with fear, was close behind. David's pulse quickened as he saw the faint outline of the power switch just beyond the corner of the building. A red light blinked from a nearby control panel, signifying that the generator was still active. The Forsaken might have been in control, but they were about to lose their advantage. "Now," David hissed. Mark and Sarah darted toward the power generator, their movements fast but controlled. Sarah reached the control panel first, and after a few moments of frantic work, she yanked the lever down with a forceful yank. The generator groaned and sputtered before going silent. The base plunged into darkness, and the faint hum of machinery stopped. For a brief moment, the world seemed still, and David allowed himself to breathe a sigh of relief. But he knew the silence wouldn't last long. The Forsaken would be aware of the power loss soon, and their time was limited. "Let's go!" David barked. The survivors rushed toward the compound's central building, their steps faster now that the guards would be distracted by the power outage. But the sound of the zombies was growing louder. The undead had heard the change, and they were beginning to stir from their resting places, drawn to the scent of the living. Inside the compound, the Forsaken were already mobilizing. The group could hear the sharp commands of their soldiers and the low hum of automated systems coming back to life as the backup power kicked in. They didn't have long before the place was back on high alert. "Move fast," David ordered as they crossed the open courtyard. "We need to hit them hard and fast." The building loomed closer now, its dark windows staring down like cold, unblinking eyes. They had no idea what awaited them inside, but David was certain of one thing: this was it. This was the final confrontation. The Forsaken would either win, or they would die trying. They reached the door to the compound, which was slightly ajar. It was a risk, but they had no time to waste. David kicked it open, the metal door swinging on its hinges with a screech that echoed through the quiet hallways. Inside, the group found themselves face to face with something far worse than they expected. The Forsaken weren't just controlling the zombies. They were transforming them. But worse still, they had begun to manipulate the living, turning them into something else, something inhuman. David's stomach twisted as he saw a soldier, once human, now a grotesque hybrid, his body covered in scars and wires. He was one of the Forsaken's creations, his humanity lost to whatever twisted experiments they had performed. "We're too late," Emily whispered in horror. "What have they done?" David clenched his jaw, a fire burning in his chest. "No. We're not too late. Not yet." And with that, they stepped into the nightmare that awaited them. The survivors stepped carefully into the Forsaken's stronghold, their hearts heavy with dread. The flickering lights cast long, distorted shadows along the narrow hallways, making every creak of the old floorboards sound like a distant footstep. Every breath felt like a betrayal of the stillness, every movement could be their last. But there was no turning back now. David led the group deeper into the compound, his rifle held tightly in his hands, scanning every corner for threats. The sounds of shuffling zombies and mechanical whirring grew louder the further they ventured. But it wasn't the undead they feared now. It was the Forsaken and the twisted creations they had made. Sarah, her face pale and tight with fear, kept her hand on her knife as she followed behind David, her eyes darting nervously around. "This place, it's worse than we thought," she murmured. The walls of the compound were adorned with strange symbols, disturbing markings that David didn't recognize. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were part of some twisted ritual, a manifestation of the Forsaken's belief that they were destined to rebuild humanity from its ruins, using anything, human or otherwise, as their foundation. The air inside the building felt colder, sharper, as though it was alive with something unnatural. David could almost feel it pressing in on them, clawing at the edges of his mind. His grip on his weapon tightened, his senses on high alert. This was not just a base, it was a laboratory of nightmares. The first door they encountered was reinforced with thick steel, its surface scratched and worn from years of use. It had a keypad beside it, but Mark had already taken the lead, his hands moving deftly as he bypassed the lock. Within seconds, the door clicked open, revealing the horrors that lay within. The room beyond was a laboratory of sorts, dark, metallic, and filled with equipment that hummed with a strange energy. But it wasn't the machines that made David's blood run cold. It was the people, the once human creatures, hooked up to life support machines, their faces slack and lifeless, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways. "These are people," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "What have they done to them?" David didn't have an answer. His eyes roamed the room, landing on a small group of figures at the center, hunched over their work. These were the Forsaken, clad in lab coats, their expressions cold and focused as they monitored the experiments. They didn't even seem to notice the survivors had entered. "This is it," Mark said, his voice tight with anger. "This is where they're doing it. Turning people into monsters." One of the Forsaken turned slightly, and for the briefest moment, David caught a glimpse of the man's eyes, empty, devoid of humanity. The scientist was beyond saving, his soul consumed by whatever twisted ideology the Forsaken followed. "We need to end this," David said, his voice low but fierce. "Now." Without hesitation, he moved forward, signaling for the group to follow. They moved quickly, but cautiously, keeping low to avoid detection. They had to get closer to the heart of the operation, to whatever sickening process was fueling the Forsaken's experiments. The group advanced deeper into the compound, past more lab rooms filled with grotesque experiments. The undead, still twitching, their bodies in various stages of decay, were everywhere. Some lay motionless on tables, while others were strapped down, their limbs moving sporadically as if still struggling against their restraints. Then, they found it. At the far end of the compound, a massive chamber stood, its walls lined with reinforced glass. Inside, a dozen people were suspended in tanks, their faces gaunt and hollow, their bodies pale and lifeless. They floated in strange, glowing liquid, hooked up to machines that beeped and whirred ominously. David's eyes narrowed. This was it. The Forsaken had turned these people into breeding vessels for their experiments, transforming them into nothing more than raw materials for their twisted vision of humanity's future. But the tanks weren't just holding people, they were holding the next generation of their abominations. Whatever twisted process they were using, it was changing these individuals into something else. Something far worse than zombies. This is insane, Emily breathed. How many more are there? Too many, David replied grimly. We need to stop this, or they'll keep making more. Sarah's eyes fell on the central tank, where a figure floated. Unlike the others, the person inside was not entirely human anymore. Their skin was mottled, their body contorted in strange, unnatural ways. The face, though still vaguely human, was partially covered in a thick layer of blackened veins, and the eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were wide open, staring unblinkingly at the survivors. David swallowed hard. That's what we're up against. These aren't just zombies, they're something worse. The sound of movement caught his attention. A shadow darted across the far side of the room, another Forsaken soldier, standing guard. David tensed. They couldn't be discovered now. The group quickly ducked behind a row of machines, holding their breath as the soldier passed. Once the coast was clear, David motioned for the group to move forward again. They were so close now. The central control panel was just ahead, where the Forsaken monitored their experiments and directed the flow of energy to sustain the grotesque transformations. David reached the panel, his hands shaking with adrenaline. He didn't have much time. With a swift motion, he began to hack into the system, pulling up the access logs. The data that flooded the screen made his stomach churn. He scanned through the research notes, the twisted ideology that guided the Forsaken's every move, and the horrifying progress of their experiments. But then, one name caught his eye, Project Omega. David's heart skipped a beat. The notes detailed a final phase, an ultimate goal of transforming both the undead and the living into a hybrid race that would dominate the earth, a new world order born from the ashes of the old one. They're trying to create an army, David muttered. And this is just the beginning. Emily stepped closer, her face pale with shock. We have to stop them, now. Before David could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. The Forsaken were closing in. The countdown had begun. There's no time, David said, his eyes hardening with resolve. Let's destroy everything. Now. They had no choice. They had to fight their way out of this nightmare, and burn the Forsaken's hellish creation to the ground. The war for humanity's future had just begun, and David was ready to see it through, no matter the cost. The compound buzzed with urgency. The Forsaken soldiers were closing in, their boots pounding against the metal floor as they prepared for a confrontation they knew was inevitable. The survivors had done what they came to do, they had infiltrated the heart of the Forsaken's operation, uncovered the depths of their madness, and found the horrifying truth behind Project Omega. But the fight was far from over. David stood in front of the control panel, his fingers hovering over the terminal as he input the final code. The countdown had already begun, ticking down with each passing second. He could hear the distant echo of the Forsaken soldiers moving through the corridors, their voices faint but growing louder. They would be here any moment. David, what are you doing? Emily asked, her voice tight with anxiety. She kept a wary eye on the entrance to the chamber, her weapon raised and ready. We need to get out of here now. I'm setting the compound to self-destruct, David replied, his voice cold but steady. This place is too dangerous to leave standing. If we don't destroy it, the Forsaken will rebuild it, and worse. Sarah, who was positioned by the door, nodded in agreement. He's right. We can't let them continue this. The sound of footsteps grew louder, now accompanied by the unmistakable hiss of automatic doors opening. They were running out of time. "All right, let's move," David barked, his mind racing through the plan. The detonation was set, but it would take a few minutes for the system to reach its peak. A few minutes they didn't have. The survivors turned and sprinted toward the exit, their footsteps echoing in the silent hallways. They had to make it back to the main entrance before the Forsaken locked the compound down completely. Their lives depended on it. As they raced through the darkened corridors, David could hear the moans of the undead in the distance, growing louder with every step they took. The zombies, drawn by the chaos and the commotion, were awakening from their slumber, eager to join the fight. The survivors pushed forward, their breath quick and ragged, adrenaline fueling their every move. Behind them, the faint sound of metal scraping against metal indicated that the Forsaken were closing in. The soldier they had seen earlier, the one who had been watching the experiments, was probably summoning reinforcements. They had to move faster. "We're almost there," Mark shouted from the front of the group. His face was grim, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. They were so close. They rounded a corner, only to find themselves face to face with two Forsaken soldiers. The men raised their rifles, their faces twisted with contempt as they aimed at the survivors. David didn't hesitate. He raised his own weapon, squeezing the trigger with precision. The first soldier went down in a spray of sparks and smoke, collapsing to the ground in a heap. The second soldier barely had time to react before Emily, who had been moving in from the other side, fired a well-placed shot that sent him sprawling to the floor. "Keep moving," David shouted, his voice steady despite the rising chaos. "We don't have time for this." The group pressed forward, their pace quickening as the entrance to the compound grew closer. But as they neared the final stretch, they encountered a new horror, something they hadn't anticipated. The door to the outside was sealed shut, the once broken mechanism now reinforced with steel. The Forsaken were locking down the base, trapping them inside. "This is it," Sarah cried, panic creeping into her voice. "We're trapped." David's mind raced. They couldn't go back. They had to get through this door. "Mark, help me with this," he shouted. Mark sprinted forward, his face hardening as he saw the reinforced locks. He dropped to his knees and pulled out a set of tools, his hands moving rapidly as he began to work on the mechanism. The sound of approaching zombies, slow, but relentless, filled the air, their dragging footsteps growing louder. David turned to face the oncoming threat, keeping his rifle at the ready. Emily stood beside him, her eyes scanning the hallway. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. "Do you think you can get it open?" Emily asked, her voice strained as she reloaded her weapon. Mark didn't look up, but his hands moved quickly, every motion calculated. "Just give me a few more seconds." David's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to move faster, but they couldn't risk running out of time. The Forsaken would be here any minute, and if they didn't get through this door, they were as good as dead. With one last twist of his wrist, Mark gave a triumphant shout. "Got it." The heavy door hissed as it slowly began to open, revealing the outside world beyond. But before the survivors could even take a breath of relief, the room was filled with the guttural growl of the undead. The first wave of zombies appeared from the shadows, their decayed bodies stumbling forward with chilling determination. They were everywhere, their twisted forms moving in a grotesque symphony of hunger and chaos. "Run!" David shouted. "Now!" They didn't need any further encouragement. The survivors bolted through the doorway, emerging into the open air just as the first wave of zombies reached them. The door slammed shut behind them with a resounding thud, but the undead weren't far behind. David looked around, scanning the barren landscape. The compound was built in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dead fields and empty streets. There was no cover, no safe place to hide. They were exposed, but they had to keep moving. "Get to the truck," David ordered, pointing to an old military vehicle parked 100 yards away. They had no choice but to make a break for it. The zombies were closing in, and the Forsaken would send reinforcements any second. The survivors sprinted toward the truck, their legs burning with exhaustion. The sound of snarling zombies filled the air, and David could feel the ground shaking as more undead joined the chase. They were fast, too fast. Just as they reached the truck, Emily was yanked off her feet by the grasping hands of a nearby zombie. She screamed, struggling against its powerful grip, but the creature's claws dug deep into her flesh. Without thinking, David dashed forward, pulling Emily free just in time. "Get in," he shouted. They piled into the truck, slamming the door behind them. The engine roared to life, and David slammed the gas pedal, sending the truck barreling down the road. The undead were in hot pursuit, but they couldn't keep up with the speed of the truck. David glanced back as the compound, the heart of the Forsaken's nightmare, disappeared into the distance. It wasn't over, not yet. But they had won victory. They had destroyed the Forsaken's twisted operation, and they had survived. For now, that was enough. The war for humanity's survival was just beginning. But David was ready to face whatever came next. And he knew, deep down, they had won a small but crucial victory. For now, they could rest. But tomorrow, the fight would continue. The truck rumbled through the desolate wasteland, its tires kicking up dust as the survivors sped away from the Forsaken's destroyed base. The once thriving world had been reduced to rubble, a barren landscape where humanity's last hope seemed like a flickering candle in the wind. Yet, amidst the chaos and devastation, there was still a small spark of hope in the hearts of the survivors. They had accomplished the impossible, they had struck a blow against the Forsaken and their twisted plans. But the war was far from over. David kept his hands tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles white with strain. He wasn't sure where they were going, there was no safe place left to call home. The map he had relied on months ago was little more than a memory, erased by the devastation and the advancing waves of the undead. Still, the truck offered a small sense of comfort, a moving fortress of sorts as the world around them crumbled. "Where do we go now?" Emily's voice was soft, barely audible over the engine's growl. She sat beside David, her eyes focused on the horizon, her face still pale from the horrors they'd witnessed. David's gaze flickered briefly toward her before he spoke. "I don't know. We'll have to keep moving, keep surviving. Maybe we can find a settlement, or maybe we just survive long enough to see another day." There was no certainty in his words, no promise of safety. But it was all they had. He could feel the weight of his decisions, the pressure of being the one to lead them through this nightmare. And for a moment, he wondered if it would ever end. Sarah, seated at the back with Mark, was cleaning her weapon, her expression hard and resolute. She caught David's gaze in the rearview mirror. "We can't stop now. If the Forsaken were as close as they were, then there are others, more like them, scattered around the country. And they're only going to get more organized." David nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of her words. The Forsaken were just one faction in a world filled with horrors beyond comprehension. But with each victory, with each battle they fought, they were gaining ground. "We've lost everything," Mark spoke up, his voice heavy with resignation. "But that doesn't mean we lose hope. If we just keep pushing, we'll find something, someone who can help. Someone who's still fighting back." David glanced at Mark, meeting his eyes for a brief moment. "I'm not sure what we'll find. But I do know one thing, we have each other. And that's more than a lot of people can say right now." A heavy silence filled the truck, each of them lost in their thoughts, processing the weight of the journey ahead. The road stretched on endlessly, disappearing into the horizon. The sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow over the ruined world. But even as darkness crept in, there was a quiet sense of determination among them. The darkness may have claimed the world, but it would not claim them. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, the static cutting through the air like a knife. Everyone tensed, eyes wide with anticipation. "This is Captain Harris of the Safe Haven Coalition," a voice came through the static, weak but steady. "If you can hear this, we're still alive. We've established a perimeter. We need survivors. If you're out there, if you can make it to Safe Haven, we will protect you. We can't hold out much longer, but we're not giving up. Please respond." David's heart leapt in his chest. Safe haven. A glimmer of hope in a world that had none. Mark leaned forward, his voice urgent. That's it. That's our chance. David's mind raced as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. Safe haven, the name alone sparked a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. It could be their last chance for sanctuary, a place where they could regroup and maybe, just maybe, rebuild what was lost. David, Emily said softly, her eyes searching his face, we have to go there. This could be our last shot. He looked at her, and then at the others in the back seat. They all nodded, their faces reflecting the same resolve. This was it, their next move. The journey to safe haven would be their hardest yet, but it was a chance they couldn't ignore. David nodded and set the truck's course, turning onto the road that would take them to what could be their final hope for survival. The wheels of the truck creaked as they hit the cracked pavement, the world around them fading into the unknown. As they drove through the night, the sky overhead slowly transitioned from the deep red of sunset to the cold, dark blue of evening. The landscape blurred past them, broken cities, abandoned homes, the skeletal remains of a world that had once been full of life and promise. The zombies were everywhere, still roaming the earth, hungry and relentless. The Forsaken's twisted reign may have ended, but there were other threats on the horizon. There would always be more. But as long as they kept moving, as long as they kept fighting, they would survive. Together. The road ahead seemed endless, but the survivors knew they had come too far to turn back. They had defeated the Forsaken, but the battle for the future of humanity was just beginning. Whatever came next, they were ready to face it head-on. For now, the survivors could only hope that safe haven would be the sanctuary they desperately needed. A place where they could catch their breath, rebuild, and plan their next move. The truck's headlights illuminated the desolate world ahead, and with it, the small flicker of hope that had started to grow within them once again. The fight for humanity's future was far from over, but as long as they had each other, they would fight to the very end. And somewhere in the distance, the faintest hint of dawn began to break through the dark, signaling the start of a new chapter in their fight for survival. The journey wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, they had a reason to believe.